Hello everybody and welcome to part 5. Now today we're going to finish tearing down the short block. There's a couple peripheral items that we still need to remove, like the oil and water lines from the turbos, the NOx sensors, our engine mounts, the oil cooler, stuff like our alternator, our AC compressor. Then we're going to address the front of the engine, remove our timing gear, the water pump, idler pulley, remove our oil pump, and then finally drop the oil pan so I can start working on that tow-made baffle. Now, I'm not going to be addressing any of the internals. I'm going to let my engine builder do that. He is far more knowledgeable than I am building top fuel, alcohol, funny cars, Formula Drift spec cars, etc. So I'm going to let him address the internals. I don't want to take a chance of me making some small mistake that's going to end up being a bigger problem down the road. I know I could take it apart. I could follow the standard work. That's not an issue. But with this level of time and money, I'm going to let him address the internals. So unfortunately, we're not going to see that. We'll see the product afterwards once it gets back. But again, I'm not going to be addressing the internals here. So let's get started. Let's take a look at some of the items that we're going to be removing. So we're going to get started on the intake side. So we're going to work our way from front to back. So we're going to work on the alternator first, then get the water inlet, remove our engine mount, get the two NOx sensors, our oil cooler, and then finally that water fitting where our heater core hose and the line from the water tube join. So working with the alternator first, we already started loosening these bolts when we removed our alternator belt. So all we need to do is finish removing this 12mm bolt at the top, which secures it to this bracket, and then we're going to finish removing this 14mm bolt and nut combo that secures it to the block. We're going to be leaving this bracket on for the time being because the two bolts that secure this to the block is also shared by the water pump. And when we remove the pump, it does have a removal sequence. So we're going to leave these in for the time being. Go ahead and remove these two bolts and remove the alternator. Next up is going to be the water inlet. There's just three 12mm bolts holding this on. For the top one, you could use an open-ended wrench or just use a 12mm socket on an extension and it should fit in this little groove feature there. In order to remove the oil cooler, we're going to have four 12mm fasteners. So it's going to be a combination of three 12mm bolts and one 12mm nut. So they're kind of laid out in the north, south, east, and west fashion. So if you look at north, south, and west, so bottom, top, and the one to the left, these are all going to be 12mm bolts. And then the one to the east, the one to the right, is going to be a 12mm nut. So you're going to have to use a combination of either your opened or closed inside. The bottom one, I'm just going to put a 12mm socket on an extension and get underneath there to remove it. We also have our oil temperature sensor, so just go ahead and depress that tab and it should slide off the terminal. Next is going to be the four 14mm bolts that's used to attach the engine mount to the block. So now on the exhaust side, working front to back, we're going to start off by working with the AC compressor. There's three different bolts that we're going to have to remove. One here at the top is already missing. Whoever worked on this before didn't even refill the gas. The line's already empty, so I didn't have to purge anything. So you're going to have one bolt at the top here, and then if you work underneath the pump, you're going to see two more bolts down underneath that's holding on the compressor to the bracket. So we're going to have to remove all three of those, well, two now, and then we'll be able to get access to the bolts that actually hold the bracket onto the block. With the compressor removed, we can see the four additional 14mm bolts that have to be removed in order for this bracket to be free of the block. If we look right above where the compressor was, we can see the bracket for the power steering. Now, we already removed this top bolt when we removed the head, so we just have two more 14mm bolts that have to be removed. I'm going to go ahead and remove the front one first.
If you look at the rear of the bracket, it's actually notched. So this one just has to be loosened in order for the bracket to slide out, and then we could go ahead and work that bolt out by hand. Moving on down the line, we have our exhaust side engine bracket, so we're going to go ahead and remove these 14mm bolts, and this will come free of the block. Next is going to be the oil drain line. Now this was sandwiched between the brackets for the power steering, the AC, and the engine mount, so we kind of had to remove all those so we have some working room to remove this guy. So go ahead and work this off with the block, and we'll pull this tube out. And then the last two items we have to remove on the exhaust side is both the oil feed as well as the water feed for the stock twin turbo setup. So here you can see the T-junction that splits out to the front and the rear, whereas for the water it just kind of has a Y coming off of that fitting there. So we're going to remove these. This one's going to be a 17mm, this one's going to be a 19mm. Now that the intake and exhaust sides have both been stripped down, we're going to be focusing our attention on the front of the engine, and we're going to remove our water pump, the last of those timing components, our oil pump, and then finally the oil pan. Alright, so we're going to start from the top down, but before we can start working with the water pump, we're going to need to remove this idler pulley. Now, I'm sure we could get a wrench back here and get this 12mm bolt, but I'd rather remove this and have better working room to go ahead and address these bolts. So take a 17mm and go ahead and remove your idler pulley now. Alright, so with the idler removed, we gain a little bit more working room to address some of these bolts. Now there's going to be 11 different bolts in total, and they're going to be of varying different sizes. So you can see that the 2, 4, 6 right here, these are going to be 12mm bolts. You're going to have one 10mm bolt right here, and then you're going to have four 14mm bolts going around the left-hand side. Okay, so 11 in total, a mixture of 10, 12, and 14 mil. Now, there is a sequence to removing these, which is why we left this bracket on when we removed the alternator. So going over that sequence, if we look at the stud that was holding our tensioner pulley on, this is going to be number 12. So we're going to start with this guy here, and then it's going to go in a counterclockwise fashion. So we have 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7. They skip 6, and it goes to 5, 4, 3, 2 is another 14mm that's underneath the pulley. And then the last one, number 1, is going to be this 10 mil here, okay? So 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 5, 4, 3, 2, and then 1. Now that all those bolts have been removed, just go ahead and get a soft rubber mallet, give it a couple love taps on either side, and it should go ahead and come loose. I'm going to be removing this stud for the tensioner. I have a brand new one that I'm going to be replacing it with, so I'm just going to use some vice grips and go ahead and rotate this out of the block. Now we can't remove the oil pump unless we drop the oil pan. So we're gonna go ahead and rotate the motor around and work on our oil pan. All right, so after a quick garage floor cleanup, make sure you guys have plenty of paper towels, shop rags, go get some kitty litter for spilt fluids, etc. We're ready to pull off the oil pan. So we have 30 different fasteners that we have to address. Some of them are gonna be bolts, some of them are gonna be nuts, some of them are gonna be different sizes. But we're basically just gonna be, again, alternating from the exhaust to the intake side and then working our way from the outside to the center, okay? So also some of the bolts you can see from the bottom, Some, you're gonna have to go to the other side, to the top side of the motor, and get those. Okay, so I figured the best would be just to show you the sequence at first. I'll go ahead and overlay the image from the service manual as well, and then I'll show you the location of each bolt when I go ahead and remove it. So if you look at the back side here where your clutch is, starting away from the front diff, you're gonna be at 30, and that's gonna go 29. Then you're gonna jump to the front, it's gonna be 28, 27, back again, 26, 25, back to the front, 24, 23, then we have 22, 21, 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, you're gonna have to go to the other side of the engine, 12, 11, 10, 9, again, other side, 8, 7, 6, other side, 5, other side, 4, 3 is gonna be on the other side, and then 2 and 1 as well are gonna be on the opposite sides of the engine, okay? So again, 30 fasteners, you're just working your way to the outside and then from the outside to the center, okay? So make sure that you're doing the alternating. I'll go ahead and again put up that image from the service manual, and then we'll go around the oil pan as we remove those. So starting at the back of the engine, on the exhaust side again, we're gonna start with number 30 right here. And then we have 29. Now we jump to the front of the engine, and again, starting on the exhaust, we have 28. And then 27. At the back again, we have 26 on the exhaust side. And then 25 on the intake side. Back to the rear, we have 22 on the exhaust side. And then 21 on the intake. Back to the front of the motor, we have number 20 on the exhaust side. And then number 19 on the intake side. Back to the rear of the motor, on the exhaust side, we have number 18. And on the intake side, you have 17. At the front, on the exhaust side, we have number 16. And on the intake side, we have 15. From the rear on the exhaust, now we have number 14. And then 13 is gonna be on the other side. Here's number 13 right underneath where the prop shaft attaches to the front differential. Back to the front on the exhaust side, here's gonna be number 12. And then here we have number 11 on the intake side. On the rear exhaust side, right behind where our passenger axle attaches, here's going to be number 10. And then for number 9, we're going to have to go to the other side of the engine. It's on the other side of our front diff here. Again, back to the front on the exhaust side, we're going to see number 8. And then on the intake side, right in front of our front diff, we could see number 7. And almost getting to the middle, right underneath where our passenger axle is, we're going to see number 6 on the exhaust side. And here on the intake side, we can see number 5. And then towards the front of where our passenger axle bolts up on the exhaust side, we see number 4. And then again, back to the intake side, right by our front diff, here we could see number 3. And then our last bolt here in the center, right underneath where that passenger axle is, here's number 2. And then our last one right here, tucked behind that front diff in the center, that's gonna be number 1. All right, now that those 30 fasteners are removed, we are ready to lift the oil pan off the block, but it does have a gasket sealer around it, so it's not just gonna come right off. We're gonna have to use some leverage. Now, if you have a seam splitter, kind of like a little wedge that you could put in, it'll help lift it up. Otherwise, you could use a long screwdriver, and instead of putting it in the middle where there's gonna be that mating surface, try and find some surfaces around the block to where you could gain some leverage and not affect that mating surface where the gasket is. There's also a couple different features built in around the oil pan that'll allow you to use a screwdriver and get some leverage. So I'm gonna work my way around the circumference of this, get it a little bit loose, and then we're gonna pull it off. All right, the home stretch. So one of the last things that we have to do is remove the oil pump, but we gotta remove this lower timing gear first. Now, a couple different ways that you could do this depending on how stuck it is. I've heard some horror stories where people have to cut these off, drill and tap holes, and use a steering wheel puller, just like you do for the pulley assembly. I'm gonna try and use 2 flathead screwdrivers, wedge behind, and give it some leverage, not too much pressure. I don't wanna crack the housing on my oil pump, but I'm just gonna give a little bit of pressure and see if it will budge. Hopefully it does. If not, we're gonna have to go with plan B. And put a little bit of grease around the nose. Hopefully that'll cut down any friction and help it slide off here. Looked like it started to come off easy at first, and then kind of once it got to where the pulley sat, kind of just stopped. All right, so the timing gear is off. It put up a little bit more of a fight than I thought it was initially. When I first started loosening it, it came about halfway and then it just kind of got stuck. So after working it back and forth, putting some lube on there, I could get it about a quarter of the way almost to being off. And then I finally had to use this little puller to work it off the rest of the way. So overall not bad. At least I didn't have to cut it in half or drilling holes into it. All right, and now the last thing that we have to do is remove 8 10mm bolts in order to separate our oil pump from the block. There's no removal sequence, so you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So go ahead and remove these, and we'll go ahead and pull this off. All right, everybody, that is gonna wrap it up for part 5. Now, along the past couple of videos, I've hoped that you've seen that it really isn't too bad to disassemble and work on an RB. Sure, some bolts are a pain to get to, some places could be a little bit tight, but all in all, the process isn't too bad. Just take it part by part, follow the procedure, I promise it will all work out. And I hope that these videos are helpful, at least a good point of reference while you guys are working on your own projects. Now, coming up in part 6, I'm gonna start working on the oil pan, get that cleaned out, get the baffle installed.
Once the engine goes off to the machine shop and my builder, I got a bunch of stuff that I got to work on the car before the engine's ready to go back in. I plan on painting the engine bay, so there's a lot of stuff that needs to be removed before that happens. Deleting the ABS, converting the power steering lines to AN. I have a lot of parts that I have to take off that's going to be powder coated along with the brakes. So the list is growing. There's going to be a lot of stuff coming down the pipeline on this channel. Please like, subscribe, share, and as always, have a good one.